We'll pick up with part two on labor economics. And now we're going to talk about market failure in terms of the labor market. When you're not paid what you're worth, when the market fails, right? If we believe in this idea that it's the value, um, your value in terms of your wage is represented by the marginal revenue product or how much you are adding value to the good and service you're selling, and you're not being paid what you're worth, there is some theories as to why, and let's go through them. So there's four examples of market failure we're going to consider: efficiency wages, discrimination, minimum wage policy, and automation. All right, so efficiency wages in many ways is when you link wages to quality. So the hypothesis is that a worker's productivity depends on his or her wage. So the higher your wage, the more productive you are because you are happier, right? So when you're thinking about hiring somebody who's willing to work for too low a wage, what it signals to you is that he or she might be incredibly unproductive. In other words, never hire anybody who's going to work for that low amount of money because they're not going to do any work. They're going to go smoke cigs behind the barn or do whatever they're doing, but they're definitely not going to work. So the idea is that we want to set the wage higher than market wage because we want to buy loyalty to really good workers. We want to buy that skill, whatever that skill is, being a team player, being loyal to the company, essentially the things that make us human again, that why we like a job or why we're loyal to a university or why we're just not complete mercenaries moving to the highest bidder no matter what. We have some stickiness in our ability to move based on loyalty, human nature, status quo. And so the efficiency wage market is that we're actually paid more than the market wage, and we're trying to discourage shirking by raising the opportunity cost of being fired. So in other words, you got a job that you're paid more than you think you really deserve, and so you really don't want to screw it up and be fired, because where are you going to get another one like it? It's going to encourage loyalty. It's going to increase the group norms in terms of how much output. You're going to get a better bunch of folks, more highly skilled, applying for the job because of the higher wages, and you're going to raise morale, right? So there are different. You can think of different restaurants in town when you're able to go out, and you always see the same wait staff there. And you go to other places, and it's always somebody new, somebody coming and going. And part of the reason is one of the restaurants pays a little bit more, creates loyalty among the crew, creates teamwork, raises morale, and essentially you are buying the labor's loyalty and trust. And it translates into fewer workers because you got to pay a higher wage, but the idea is it pays off because they're more productive. So even though you've got fewer that are being paid a higher wage, your profits go up because your productivity goes up. So what an efficiency wage looks like in terms of the graph, as you can see, the market wage would be where supply and demand intersect, just like we've done all semester. The efficiency wage then is set above it, so you can see that there is going to be less of a demand for that wage and much more of a supply. And then the difference there between the demand and the supply, which would be called a shortage, or in the labor market, it's unemployment. So you got people who really want this job, and you've got suppliers who are essentially cutting back the workforce but paying a higher wage. And so what that unemployment number means is you got a lot of people sitting at the door whenever there is an opening in your company, boom, you've got a good application pool. So in this sense, it's a market failure because we're not at the market clearing price. We're setting it above, and that's a good thing. It's a good thing for the workers. It's a bad thing in terms of social policy because there is deadweight loss in creating voluntary unemployment because I've put the wage up and now I've got this gap between who wants a job and who's got a job in this particular industry. And that creates deadweight loss, which you can see is that triangle then to the left of the intersection of supply and demand, right? It's that little triangle to the left, which would represent lost surplus because you've raised the wage and restricted the quantity of labor employed. So there's deadweight loss here, which for society, you're like, oh, that's no good. But for the company and for the workers that get a job, that is a good thing in terms of the efficiency wage. But overall, there are deadweight losses, right? And so can you find the area? Go back and look at that graph again. Like I said, it's the little triangle to the left of what would have been the market clearing price. Market discrimination in wages. This one is always incredibly important because, if you feel like you're being discriminated against because of your gender, because of your race, because of your religion, because of your sexual orientation, then we're not valuing you based on the labor market and value created. We're valuing you based on some observable characteristics, right? I can see that you're a man, I can see you're a woman. All right, so therefore I'm going to offer the job to the man and pay them $100 an hour, or I can offer it to you, the woman, and pay you $75 an hour, right? Same qualifications, etc. And if I start doing that, well, then obviously I'm discriminating based on gender. Same with race, age, national origin, sexual orientation, and so on. Anytime I'm setting the wage not based on your value added to the product, I'm discriminating. So if we look at the top 10 countries with the smallest gender gap, we see the Nordic countries, Iceland, Norway, Finland, Sweden, are really dominating the story here. We also see Nicaragua is fairly high, New Zealand, Ireland, Spain, Rwanda, and Germany round out the top 10 in terms of this year. But and again, this is gender gap, but you can still see that even in Iceland, women make 87%, almost 88% of the man's dollar. If we look at it here, here's another idea of median net worth. Now this time it's based on race. White, black, Hispanic, other. And you can see without a bachelor's degree, white has a lot higher net worth, and with a bachelor's degree, a lot higher. I mean, we're talking almost 400,000 versus 100,000. But what's interesting is blacks and Hispanics with a bachelor's degree still don't reach the level of net worth as a white household. Is that discrimination? Is that structural impediments that go back to slavery? What is going on here? I mean, what is the challenge? I mean, slavery, we ended 150 some years ago. Hasn't that been a long enough time to overcome this structural racial inequality? And clearly, it does not seem so. Here's one in terms of lesbians compared to heterosexual women with comparable education, skills, and experience. And we see in some countries, Greece and Australia, lesbians earn less. And in other countries, the US, Canada, Germany, they earn more. So what's going on here? These are the kind of things that economists are interested in to try to explain, what's happening in Australia and Greece versus the United States and Canada. I mean, could it be policies? Could it be no, you know, an ability to discriminate based on sexual orientation that happens in Greece and Australia, and in the US and Canada, there's not. But then why would there be 20% more? France and Sweden makes sense if there's no discrimination because that's zero, right? It doesn't really matter. And in that sense, there's no discrimination going on. So economists spend a lot of time thinking about these things because obviously your wage matters to you. Putting in effort, putting in work, whether you're doing it as a private business, as a public enterprise, whether you're a private worker, government worker, whether you're self-employed, all these things matter because, you're spending your time to earn a living to get the things you want and avoid the things you don't. And, economists are concerned about this. So why does discrimination occur in the labor market? Three basic ideas. The taste model from economist Gary Becker, who's from the Chicago School, who's very much a microeconomist who focuses in on just rational behavior and how can you rationalize discrimination. And his argument was that discrimination arises because people have preferences or tastes for their own kinds of people. Define their own kinds of people however you want. Could be based on, again, race, could be based on national origin. If you immigrated into the U.S. anytime in the last century, a lot of times you end up in neighborhoods with folks from your original country. If you came from Jamaica, you'd end up in a Jamaican neighborhood in New York City, or if you came from Italy, you'd end up in an Italian neighborhood, etc. Because there's this taste to be with your own kind of people. And you'll pay a price to avoid contact with other groups, and so then you start getting this economic rationale as equivalent to prejudice, or it's a taste for the people you know and familiar with. So how do you separate those two things out? So if I like hanging out with other Swedes, does that make me prejudiced, or does that mean I just have a preference for hanging out with other Swedes because I know them and I understand them and I understand their culture, etc., because in the way I've grown up, blah, blah, blah. And trying to tease that out and say, well, a preference for hanging out with your own kind is bad. Well, from an economic viewpoint, it's not always bad because you got more trust there potentially, you got fewer transactions costs. You don't have to go through complicated negotiations because you know what to expect from this group. There's less economic friction, etc. So, but it's not one of the more popular theories right now because it's this idea that you can rationalize prejudice, or it's rational to have taste for your own kind, which sound like one idea just on different sides of the coin. Another one is the employer is uncertain of a worker's productivity, right? So I can't observe your productivity. I don't know if you're going to shirk. I don't know if you're going to work hard. And so I use some observable characteristic like gender and race as proxies for this idea of how productive you are. And this assumes certain groups, again, it's a bias, hidden bias, explicit bias, but it's a bias that somehow I can look at a person and I can assess if they're going to be more or less productive and then pay them more or less based on my assessment. So you go for those interviews and to get a job, and they're trying to suss you out based on how you answer these questions, whether or not you're going to be productive, whether or not you're going to make big contributions, little contributions. Man, that's a tough one. From an economic perspective, a lot of people learn by doing, and they end up being the best, even though they started off at the low end of the stick. You gave them a chance, and they turn out to be fantastic. But these companies, and you guys probably study it more than I do in terms of trying to sort out a shirker from a worker and trying to sort out what traits lead to a good worker, etc. But this uncertainty in the labor market based on skill type that I can observe becomes very important. And how do you then say, well, I chose A over B because of my guess at how productive you're going to be. And if it happens to be that I chose a man over a woman, it wasn't discrimination. It was because I thought the man was going to be more productive than the woman. That's what I thought. And I went through my standards and all my tests, and I went through the to be aware of any hidden biases. I went through all that training, and I still took a man over a woman. Then I am saying that it's because totally of productivity and not because of some latent gender bias. I mean, that's what economists are trying to tease out. We don't spend as much time in terms of, say, programs and information systems in terms of educating people on these biases, because we assume people are rational and they would only hire somebody if they're more productive. That's a mistake by economists, right? That economists would just say, well, it must be they hired person A over B because A was more productive than B. That's the end of story. Of course, we know it's not that simple. Occupational crowding out effects. It's an old theory that popped up during the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, and that the idea was of women's lower pay back in the early 20s was explained by the fact that women crowd into small numbers of occupations and therefore drive the wage down. So if the unions had excluded women from doing men's work, quote unquote, and caused an oversupply of female workers to do women's work, then that oversupply would drive the wage down. And so now you got this occupational crowding where the men sort into men's jobs and the women sort into women's jobs. And the union is fighting to keep the men's wages high, and the women haven't organized their own union, and that competition pushes the wages down. That's the idea behind it. And you could say the same thing for race too. So these institutional barriers would artificially distort the market, and it would push lower wages for some, higher wages for others. Back in the early 70s, Barbara Bergman took this model and said the same thing about black men, in which they are crowded into low-wage occupations back in the 70s and crowded out of high-wage occupations due to employer discrimination. And, they went and got empirical evidence, got the data, and this theory sure seemed to explain why you saw this clustering of wages where you have a low-wage group and a high-wage group, and there's nothing else to explain it other than people are segregated into these groups based on some structural institutional rules. All right, so it's a pretty simple but powerful theory, and you're looking at supply and demand, and it's the idea is that if you can restrict the number of laborers in one market, they're going to make more money. And it may be that race is a figure. It may not be. It's be the first one in the door that then tries to pull up the ladder once he has, or she, well, in this case, he has enough men like him doing this job. I'm going to pull the ladder up behind me because we have the high wage and nobody else can come in and do this job, and especially not women. because of how I've structured it, then you would see this differential in wages based on crowding. So the question is, with unions and accreditation and entry becomes embedded in the system, and you don't even think about it anymore. And it's not necessarily intentional. It was back when it started, but now, 50 years later, 100 years later, it wasn't meant to be intentional, but there it is as an institutional rule that's embedded in the system. So essentially, the market is distorted, and the market is only as good as the rules that we use to define it. I mean, the market works for us, not the other way around. And when we set bad rules up for the market is going to fail to deliver the social good, in terms of equal opportunity and equal wages for equal skill and experience. And when those structural rules exist in a labor market, you'll definitely see these inequalities emerge in terms of who gets paid what and the ability to collect wealth. If we think back at that graph where the amount of net wealth of non-college degree white household still exceeded the net wealth of Hispanic and Black college degree households, right? That structural impediment and is embedded in the system, and you got to work your way back to the beginning to figure out how do you break that link and come up with new sets of rules. And we're seeing a lot of that happening right now in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement. And also, one of the bigger things we'll talk about here in a second is this idea of reparations. So one interesting experiment that some economists ran to test this occupational crowding out theory was this paper here. Are Emily and Greg more employable than Lakeisha and Jamal? And they run a field experiment where they drafted up fake resumes to answer to real help wanted ads in Chicago and Boston. And they sent these resumes with either African American, white sounding names. Then they measured the callbacks they received for each interview, right? And so they manipulated, based on statistics, the perceptions of race via the name. Half the applicants had an African American name that were quote unquote remarkably common. The other half had white sounding names like Emily Walsh, Greg Baker. Now, they varied the quality of the resumes. But the idea is that statistically at the end, you could hold everything constant except the name. So we'd have two identical resumes, and the only difference would be the name and perhaps the address where they lived. Could be identified as a posh neighborhood, or could be identified as a project neighborhood, could be identified as rural or urban, but most of these are all urban since they were doing them in Chicago and Boston, right? So they answered 1,300 ads, and they sent out about 5,000 resumes so that they could get enough data and so they could create a model and use econometrics and the statistical tools to see if indeed they could find any discrimination, this crowding out. And so they applied, for a number of different jobs as well, not just one particular job. So what did they find? Callback rates. And white names tended to send 10 resumes to get one callback. African Americans, 15. 10 and 15, it's not a huge difference, but it's a significant difference. I mean, if I could send out 100 and get 10 callbacks, and you have to send out 50% more than me to get the same number of callbacks, something's going on, because holding everything constant, the only difference was my name versus your name. And it would either suggest the employers are prejudiced or the employer perception that race signals lower productivity. And that's, as an economist, that's the only two things that can explain it. Either I'm prejudiced or I'm clairvoyant on your productivity based on your name, because everything else is being held constant. Your education, your experience, the resumes are exactly the same except for our names, right? So white names, 50% more likely to get a call back, all else equal. Better neighborhoods, more likely to get a call back, white or black. And federal jobs, which pushes equal opportunity employers in the ad and pushes it out to all the private sector, discriminated as much as other employers. So, I mean, this is another reason people get frustrated with the federal government. This also raises the question of, and you can hear my dogs barking up there. This also raises the question of the economic reparations for slavery. Now, if we talked about these institutional rules that are in place for hundreds of years, well, 1619, for hundreds of years, the question is whether or not we should compensate African Americans for slavery that ended 150 years ago, because the notion being that slavery did not allow African Americans to accumulate capital. And as we've said, capital accumulation is the key, right? It's the rule of 72. The faster your money grows, the more quickly your standard of living doubles. And if you're not allowed to accumulate capital, your standard of living never changes, not over 100 years. So the question is today whether or not we should be paying reparations for an institutional structure that did not allow a whole entire group of people to accumulate capital that would allow them the standard of living we have today, or that some of us have today, because flat out discrimination and slavery. Right? And so here's a good link. You can read more about this, but the idea is that the average black household has a net worth about $800,000 lower than the average white household. Right? And so this then means with more capital, and essentially let's just say $1 million extra, that gives me more opportunities to send my kids to school. That gives me more opportunities to invest in new business opportunities, new stock markets. I basically have more grease. I can do more because I've got more assets. And so when we look at this, Black Americans have 2.6% of the nation's wealth, while constituting 13% of the population. So it's like you're trying to run a race and somebody has tied a ball and chain to your ankle and says, good luck. And then at some point they take it off and they say, well, why can't you catch up? Well, because the race is cumulative. It's not annual, right? So it's this whole idea of a stock versus flow. And the stock of capital really matters. So you could say, well, yeah, but everybody's equal today and everybody should get the same flow. Well, yeah, well, that might be true. If we have equal opportunity and everybody should get the same annual income. But given the way we've set it up, the stocks are completely different based on whether or not you were descendants from slavery versus not descendants from slavery. And so you can say, well, how far back do we go? Do we go all the way back to 1619? What about slavery and the Vikings? Or what about, how far back do we go? Well, that's a fair question. But in terms of the relevant question we're talking about now, we're talking about the U.S. and talking about slavery in the U.S. Okay? So the argument here is that we should be handing out 10 to 12 trillion, that's about half of the US GDP, annual GDP, in reparations, right? So how much to pay and how best to spend the money. And a couple of economists argue that this 10 to 12 trillion would help close the gap between black and white wealth because it would rebalance the stock of capital, which would then allow the same chance, the same rule of 72 to get wealthier, to increase your standard of living, because we've rebalanced the scale. You can take a look at this blog here from the Brookings Institute if you want to get into it. Now, from a fairness standpoint, it's hard to argue against that. I mean, if, put yourself in anybody's shoes who is a descendant from slavery, where all that labor, they weren't paid what they were worth. They did not have any chance to accumulate capital. And so now today, yeah, okay, everything's equal on an annual basis, on a flow basis, but everything is not equal on a stock basis. And so what reparations is talking about is rebalancing the stock, not the flow. The flow will come by itself, given you have equal opportunity laws, debatable there too, but the stock is what needs to be rebalanced. How would they be redistributed? Well, that's a tougher question. Do we cut a check to everybody? Do we set up endowments? Do we invest in infrastructure in poorer neighborhoods? Do we just put aside 10 to 12 trillion dollars and say, come up with a plan? I think there's a lot to think about here in terms of how to structure it. But at least according to these economists, that the vast majority of payments just should go to people, individual people. And they can best figure out what they want to do with this increase in their stock of capital. And you could say, well, that's not fair to people today because we weren't, imposing, I'm not personally imposing slavery on anybody. Yeah, true. But slavery existed. And if you're really going to reset the button for people in the United States, don't focus on the flow completely. Focus in on the stock. That is the biggest difference between haves and have-nots in the United States right now. And it's around the world, right? Two things, stock and flow. Having the stock will generate the flow. And if you have a steady flow, you'll never be able to generate the stock the same way unless it's reset with these reparations. Okay, let us come back to this one in the next part.